Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth Reuse Materials or Materials Reuse Deep Dive Forum. This is the fifth in our series. We hold them quarterly. Today's forum is about reuse and climate action plans. I will get it together in just a second. My name is Marianne Remolador. I'm the Assistant Director for the Northeast Recycling Council, also known as NERC. NERC is the host and organizer of the forums, and I want to thank our sponsor, Eco Products. So, that's acting very fast. Okay. So the NERC is a nonprofit organization. That works with the 11 Northeast states. Over the last 37 years that we've been in existence, we've built a very strong network between the 11 Northeast states and industry, who are part of our advisory members, along with trade associations, nonprofits, consultants, and we do this in various ways by coming together for webinars and forums, as well as conferences throughout the year. We also work with a planning committee to develop these forums, and this is a very strong group. It's all female, and everyone on that committee is listed here on this slide for you to see, but it's them who you can thank for these forums, making them happen. For the purposes of the forum, I wanted to make sure you all are aware when we say material reuse, we mean the reuse of durable goods, including construction materials, consumer and household items, electronics, books, textiles, fixtures, and furnishings. I'd like to now introduce you to Emily Barker, Executive Director of Reuse Minnesota. Emily will be moderating today's forum.
Thanks so much, Marianne, and welcome everybody. It's very exciting to see. We already have over 200 people on, so this is really fantastic. I am joining you from the chilly Midwest, where it has finally decided to be winter, and I'm looking forward to hearing about this and thinking about it, especially because we've had a very odd winter, and thinking about climate change and climate plans and why reuse plays such an important role in that. Just a short introduction, Reuse Minnesota is a nonprofit that does advocacy for all things reuse. So we do educational programming and outreach and all sorts of policy work as well. So we love to connect with people all around. So if that's an interest in you, you're in the Midwest, especially, be sure to get in touch. I am going to be moderating, as Marianne mentioned. So I'm first going to just introduce all of our panelists today. How this schedule will work is we're going to have the first two presenters, and then we're going to do a brief Q&A, and then the last two presenters. One of our presenters needs to be done at a particular time, so that's why we're going to do that, to make sure any questions for them are able to be reached. With that, we are going to be starting with Kate Bartelt. She's the Sustainability and Resiliency Lead, Resources for HDR. After Kate will be Julie Samet from the US EPA Region 1. She's the Climate Change Coordinator. And then we'll have our first Q&A, and then Amanda Jordan, who is the Circular Economy Project Manager for the City of Phoenix, will speak. And then we'll wrap up the day with Gary Feinland, who's the Waste Reduction and Recycling Outreach and Education Section Supervisor with the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. So we are very excited and look forward to your questions. I will be watching the chat. As mentioned, we'll have those specific Q&A times. So if your question's not getting answered right away, don't worry, I'll be watching for those. And then we'll have lots of time to get to go. So Kate, without further ado, would you like to go ahead and start?
All right. Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Kate Bartelt, and I have the pleasure of starting this webinar and getting us started today. I just have to note that this is a copyrighted presentation. Uh, so this is me. So I'm Kate Bartelt. I am the Sustainability and Resiliency Lead at HDR. I have been spending over 20 years of my career really looking at this intersection of people and policy around waste and where we can go. So this is an area that I'm excited to talk to you all about today. So no matter where you get your news, whether that be mainstream media or local sources, federal resources, climate has been everywhere. The chatter is everywhere. We're seeing it in grants and where we're going. But what does that all mean? When we talk about climate, what role does waste really have to play in that space, in that conversation? And that really is setting the conversation where we wanted to start with. So there's a bit of an echo.
I'm looking to see, somebody was unmuted. That should be taken care of now, Kate.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, everybody. So, how did this all get started? So, a group of HDR policy folks were talking about what are those big questions that are really driving the conversation around waste. And it kept coming back to what are those big trends? Climate is the biggest trend that we were seeing. We know that waste has to be collected, but what is the role in waste in becoming carbon neutral? Waste collection, waste management, waste diversion has the potential to impact the quality of all of our lives, regardless of where we live, play, do business. But what's that impact? And so we wanted to dive into it because the initial searching is that we saw that there was relationships, but how is it being talked about? So instead of starting from the side of the solid waste perspective, we actually looked at it from the side of what was in published climate action plans. So this is where the research began. So we took a look at 20 climate action plans from 15 cities, 5 counties, spanning 13 US states and one major Canadian city to really see what were in those published plans to date. Did they talk about solid waste? What are they thinking? Going in, we had no expectations of what was going to be in there. So this next slide I'm going to show you is very busy. I don't expect you to read everything on the slide. I'm just giving you that warning. So what did we find? We found that there was a lot of climate action plans. And when we started looking at them, we were trying to figure out how do we bucket them? How do we index them? So I'm a solid waste planner. Maybe many of you are as well. And so we started to look at things through that lens of a solid waste planner. Were there waste strategies around organics? Were there strategies around reuse and source reduction, recycling? So we really looked at it from that lens and found that there were solid waste strategies in all the areas of the waste hierarchy. So before we dive into this a little further and get into the reuse strategies, I just want to ground us on why do we think this matters today and for this conversational space. And to start with, the conversation is occurring. You know that, many of us know this, but the conversation is occurring from the climate perspective and the solid waste perspective. Our residents are asking for additional services and opportunities. There's a lot of opportunities for shared programming, education, whether that be unique partnerships and funding or how we find solutions. But there's a lot of those opportunities out there right now. For the first time, there's actually some federal funding available through the US EPA, through the USDA, and we have a presenter later on talking about where those funds are at and how they can be tapped into. So we just thought it was important to really highlight these conversations are going on. And when you looked at these solid waste, or when you looked at these climate action plans, solid waste is part of that solution and part of achieving those climate goals. So what did we find in the research? So first, and sadly, there is no one solution from the solid waste perspective that's going to meet or exceed in any of the 20's community climate identified metrics. I wish that I could say that there was an easy button, but there is not. The solid waste management plan is included in every one of those 20 climate action plans, but many solutions are going to be needed in order to achieve those plans. So when we looked at those a little further, this is what we found that was interesting. When you look at a climate action plan, it reads a little different than a solid waste management plan. And I think this framing is really important for us from the solid waste perspective. So let's talk about just one example. Recycling in a climate action plan is often talked about as embedded energy in a can. It's looking at what does that one can do for us? And that one can is often already source separated, cleaned, arrived at a facility for processing. Well, in solid waste plans, we know that there's 100,000 aluminum cans mixed with 12 tons of other recyclables that might be in bags that have to be depackaged and separated and sorted. So that whole line of getting an aluminum can from the generator to that final processing just happens in some climate action plans. It's that process is just dealt with. So it's a little bit different when we talk about them. So the language is not exactly the same. So we have to read it from a little bit different lens when you're making correlation. But same communities, same policymakers, the same residents and businesses that need to be making changes, and the same communications channels that would be used. So there is those realities. So we found that there were 300 individual race-related climate action plan strategies identified across all 20 plans, and really embedding those strategies from very direct operations to, oh, sorry, things are moving quickly, bigger pictures. But today we really are talking about reuse and source reduction. So when we went in and took a look to join this webinar, what was really in these plans right now for source reduction? So first off, source reduction and reuse was not in all 20 climate action plans. It was only found in 15 of the 20. But those 15 did embed source reduction and reuse as pivotal to decarbonization plans for long-term climate resiliency. So 70 total strategies. So let's take a look at those strategies in a little bit more detail to show you what's in them. So when we took a look at those strategies and kind of bucketed them, they can fall into kind of 5 big categories. So one is reuse, repair, and donation. So this is really looking at single-use packaging focus, reuse, donate, action-oriented strategies. The largest category was in sustainable purchasing, and this really focused on preventing the purchase of single-use or packaging materials. How do you build in sustainable purchasing practices so that you have ongoing support for these programs? The other categories here, there was 15 total strategies regarding education and outreach, 7 strategies around financial and partnerships, and only 4 that identified a need for increased reuse infrastructure. So let's look at this. The reuse, repair, and donate category was very robust. It was looking at offering access to reuse and repair through already existing infrastructure within communities. So was this at a community center, at a sustainability campus, on a landfill or waste disposal site? A lot of focus on things such as a tool library, and really understanding that reuse and reuse opportunities need to be both local and a little bit more regional, but that education and outreach has an opportunity to hit a lot of different folks within our communities and maybe help provide some of the societal pressure relief on getting some of those durable goods back into other people's hands. There was a large focus on single-use packaging reduction, as I mentioned, and some of these were as far as putting bans on not being able to use single-use packaging bags, or everything to desiring to investigate extended producer responsibility. So if you produce that single-use material, you have to be the one to then pay for its proper management. Sustainable purchasing had 26 different strategies in there. Once again, it was across 15 different climate action plans. So really focusing on how do you ensure what doesn't get purchased in the future? And some of those individual strategies here. So the city of Toronto had a strategy specifically looking at enabling businesses to reduce waste and engage in sustainable consumption by implementing single-use and takeaway items reduction strategies. So they didn't go so far as to say ban materials of like clamshells or other takeout containers, but really starting that conversation. Another example, Ann Arbor, Michigan, actually had a strategy to implement a single-use ban or a fee if you use those single-use bags. Where another region, Mid-America region, which is near the Kansas City, Missouri area, was encouraging state policies to adopt or that reduce single-use packaging, support product stewardship, and to facilitate the right to repair. So that right to repair legislation support, in addition to product stewardship, was emerging more and more through these various strategies. Engagement and partnerships. As we all know within solid waste, we can't do this alone, and that was very much echoed in what we saw in these strategies, is that but the need for education was a little different than what we see in some of our solid waste policy plans. It's really moving away from just the yes, no list to the why. Why reuse matters. What are those benefits? What are those impacts? And really trying to drive that why into the conversation, which is kind of different from where things have been in the solid waste area, where we've really been to a yes, no list area. And there's very much an understanding of the relationship between reuse and equity and inclusion here, making sure that you're serving those underserved communities, that you're thinking about the images that you use to reflect the various communities that you have, different cultures, different ethnicities, but really understanding that this is an area for a lot of growth and opportunity. There was no clear role for the public sector in establishing reuse programs that came out of these climate action plans that we looked at. They were kind of all over the board on where the public should play a role. You know, there was an acknowledgement that they wanted to go beyond the garage sale in the Facebook marketplace, but a lot of confusion on what that actually means and what that could look like. 4 of the communities did identify a need to develop infrastructure, such as a reuse site at their landfill. And we have another speaker later today that's going to talk about that as a specific example. So some of these communities are figuring out that their role can be larger and what that could look like and want to do that investigation. So in overview, reuse is part of the climate action plans that we're seeing out there, that it is an identified strategy that has value in helping to drive waste diversion and achieve those long-term decarbonization goals. There were no clear metrics identified in these plans. A lot of confusion over how you measure reuse. How do you show that impact? And a lot of strategies were identify how, research how. So that's a role and opportunity for us to be able to help support this conversation. Strong desires for creative partnerships and financing. How do we fund these programs to move past concepts into large-scale reuse and implementation? And that reuse really has an opportunity and it has a need and an opportunity for innovative infrastructure and operations. There was a lot of understanding in these plans that things do need to be collected and managed, but how do you do that beyond the curb and traditional curbside programming? And a strong desire for inclusion and community engagement, that we can go to the community to ask how they want to be involved going forward. And so a lot of very positive pieces here, but a lot of questions that need some solving and some practical applications behind them. And that's why I'm excited for the other speakers today to talk about how they're taking reuse and implementing those into action. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'll be part of the first Q&A. This is a QR code that connects to my LinkedIn account, and I'd love to hear from you at any time.
Thanks, Kate. I think it's really interesting to see that as someone who lives in Minnesota and a community that does have a climate action plan that has some elements of reuse. In my previous working for the city, it was nice to see those in there, but it certainly is an opportunity for a lot more. So thank you for sharing that. One just really quick question, because I think this is fast. The 4 cities that wanted to do infrastructure development, do you know which 4 those were?
I will pop them in the chat.
Okay, perfect. All right, with that, Julie, thank you for joining us next. And if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen. That's right.
I have to unmute myself first because I lost my controls. Apologies. All right, can you see it now?
It went away. It was shared, although, oh, this screen broadcast.
Oh, that shouldn't be it. I don't know what that is. All right, I'll try this again. Apologies.
No worries.
How about that?
I am not seeing a presentation. I don't know if anybody else, I'm seeing, it says you are sharing screen. It's like
Okay.
a Zoom.
Same.
You are
It's actually
sharing
something
screen.
I've never seen before, so I don't know.
Maybe you need to click that red stop sharing.
Yeah, try that, because it actually looks like you're sharing the chat. Like you're sharing Zoom. I don't know if you did it where you like select the specific application to do share of the PowerPoint versus like share your screen.
Okay, let's try something. Let's just share my screen and we'll do it that way.
Oh, there I am.
Can you see it now?
That looks good.
Okay, best laid plans. I thought I had this down. Apologies.
You're good. Thank you.
Thanks. As Emily mentioned, I'm Julie Samet. I am the US EPA Region 1 Climate Change Coordinator, and Region 1 covers the 6 New England states, as well as 10 federally recognized tribes. And today I am going to talk about some of those exciting funding opportunities that Kate alluded to in her presentation. So first, I quickly want to put some, just like Kate did, put some context into this. So EPA is tackling the climate crisis by working across all sectors, and that does include the waste and materials management sector, as well as agriculture working in natural lands. I just want to point that out as well. The waste and materials sector account for just under 3%, 2.66%, as I note on my slide here, of all greenhouse gas emissions in the US in 2021. That is the most recent data we have. There's a little bit of a time lag there. Of those emissions, landfills, as you can see on my bar graph to the right, they account for the largest portion of greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions, when I refer to them, I'm really referring to carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And just, I know I said 2.66%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but I just want to point out that not all greenhouse gases are equal, and they have this thing called a global warming potential, where it's how they trap energy. It's their potential to trap energy. So as you can see, methane and nitrous oxide actually have a significantly higher ability to trap energy, and therefore have a higher climate change impacts. So the waste and materials management sector have a huge, significant opportunity to impact climate change. So quickly, I'm going to talk about some current funding opportunities, some planned ones, and then connect climate action plans to actually an existing funding opportunity, an exciting funding opportunity that's going on now. So first get to the money that's out there, I guess. Environment. So I want to talk briefly about the environmental and climate justice community change grants. I'm going to call it the community change grants because it's a very long title, but it is a $2 billion with a B dollar program. It's looking to fund community-driven projects to address climate change, legacy pollution, and historic disinvestment. As part of the requirements, these projects must address at least one of several climate strategies, and that includes waste reduction and management to support a circular economy. So hopefully there'll be many applications within that space. To ensure projects are place-based and community-focused, the eligible entities are actually community-based organizations, either in partnership or together, or partnership between a CBO, community-based organization, or a federally recognized tribe, local government, or an institute of higher learning. The deadline is November 21st, 2024, and it is a rolling deadline, which is not something we commonly do at EPA. So on the construction side, wanted to mention two opportunities that I realize are closing relatively soon. Apologies for that. The Reducing Embodied Greenhouse Gas Emissions for Construction Materials and Products program is a $100 million competitive grant, and that goes to businesses who are manufacturing, remanufacturing, and refurbishing construction materials. But it also will be, funding will also be provided to states, tribes, and nonprofits that are supporting those efforts. And you have about a week to write that and get that in. The second program is, oh, and actually, sorry, I forgot to mention about what it actually does. So the program is to improve transparency and disclosure of the embodied greenhouse gas data in construction materials so that buyers know what they're buying and that they truly are buying, that they can choose the lower embodied carbon materials. For the HFC, or hydrofluorocarbon reclaim and innovation destruction grants, that's $15 million for innovative projects and destruction technologies. So they're aiming to make products or those technologies more available so that we don't have to produce HFCs. And as I talked about global warming potential before, HFCs have an incredibly high global warming potential, anywhere from 100 to over 12,000, depending on which HFC, because it's a class of gases. So depending on which one you're talking about. So sustainable materials management, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which I'll refer to as BILL, was passed in 2021. And it allowed for $350 million for recycling infrastructure and education. Two of the larger grant programs are mentioned right here. $55 million per year for what we call the SWIFR grant program, so the Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling grant program, and $15 million per year for recycling, education, and outreach grants. There are no opportunities right now, unfortunately, but I do have links to all of these programs and EPA's websites at the end. So you should check those out and keep checking them out frequently as announcements will be posted there. The SWIFR program provides grants to improve post-consumer materials management and infrastructure. They're supporting local post-consumer management as well as recycling programs and assist waste management authorities in making decisions and improvements. The recycling education program is exactly what it sounds like. It is an education, it funds education opportunities and outreach to improve recycling and reduce contamination in the recycling stream. So I said there was no opportunities available at the moment. However, we did just announce in last fall awards for the three SWIFR programs. There's a state program, which is a non-competitive program, a community program, and a tribal program. So here is the 25 community grants that we just awarded back last fall. On the left, you can see how the geographic distribution across the regions. See, there's quite, everyone received grants across the country. So regardless of where you were, people are implementing these grants. And then on the right, you can see the diversity. There's a ton of diversity, and I think this complements the slide that Kate was showing previously of the diversity of things that people are addressing. Here, composting is 32%, and then reused infrastructure at 12.5%. So I will mention the tribal. As I said, there were 3, and the third one was tribes. So they too had a diversity of project types. Here, reuse infrastructure is highlighted, and we gave them mostly to individual tribes, but however, there were some intertribal consortia that were awarded these grants. So stay tuned, and please, at the end, you'll see my resources page. Please sign up for any listservs that might be on the website so that you can get more information about this in the future. Okay, so I've talked about grants, funding opportunities. However, now I want to connect that and build the bridge to climate action plans. So I want to talk about the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. So CPRG for short, I'll use that acronym. And this slide is extremely dense, so I don't expect you all to read it, or you can read it at a later date, but I will just summarize. The overarching objective of the CPRG program is to reduce pollution across economic sectors, including waste management, as well as agriculture, natural, and working lands. Additionally, these reductions must benefit everyone, especially low-income and disadvantaged communities. You may have heard of the Justice 40 initiative. This program falls within that. So again, 40% of the benefits from this program must be directed towards low-income and disadvantaged communities. So, and this actually, Kate had mentioned about moving from planning to implementation. I think the CPRG program is actually a really great program for that. There are 2 phases in this program. First is the planning, and that was a non-competitive grant given to states, metropolitan statistical area, or MSAs, air pollution control agencies, territories, or tribes, and they're planning, they're building strategies and planning their approach and their opportunities to address greenhouse gases. These were awarded last summer for the most part, and the recipients are actively working on them. And in a couple of slides, I will tell you how you can get involved in these grants. The second phase is a competitive implementation portion. So as Congress wrote in the law, the Inflation Reduction Act, this phase is intended to build off the planning grants. So it is intended to actually implement the strategies identified under the planning grant. And this is $4.6 billion to turn those plans into action. So, and they're intended to build capacity as a whole. CPRG is intended to build capacity and set the framework to compete. Not just for implementation grants. So the planning, we are asking recipients to think beyond just the implementation, to think across the federal suite of funding that's available, and outside of federal funding. Think of non-federal funding, state, a nonprofit, for-profit entities that are providing funding. So look across. So quickly, this is a map of all the recipients of the planning grant. The yellow are states that received it. The red dots are the MSAs, the municipal statistical areas. There are tribes as well as territories that also received that are not reflected on this slide. Here are the 3 deliverables. So I was talking about the climate action plans. There's actually 2 required as part of this grant program. The Priority Climate Action Plan, the PCAP, or in the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan, which is the CCAP. The PCAP is due in March 1st, as you can see here, and it's intended to focus, as the name implies, priority. So near-term priority greenhouse gas measures. And it is a prereq for the implementation plan, which is phase 2, as I mentioned before. The CCAP, which is due a little bit later, so next year, that is going to focus on all the sectors. So in the next slide, I'll talk to you about the different sectors. I mentioned waste and materials management being some of them. But I will go through that in the next one. And this can look at both near term as well as long term and must address all of those sectors. And last but not least, in 2027, for states and MSAs, they will be required to update any analysis to provide a status update on where they are for implementing the measures that are identified both in the PCAP and the CCAP. And just to think about next steps, what's needed, how are they going to continue to make progress beyond the grant period here? So how can you get involved? I promised this before, I teased this before. First, on the right, you can see the 6 sectors that the CCAP has to address all of them. The PCAP addresses priorities within these and can be selected by the recipients. So the PCAP is currently being developed right now by our recipients. And so the measures in these climate action plans have to address greenhouse gases in these key sectors. So they're developing these PCAPs right now. So this is, and part of that, their requirement to develop these is to engage stakeholders, both in the public and private sector, as well as within their own agencies. So they're supposed to be coordinating and engaging you. And that's a requirement of the grant in the development of both the PCAP and the CCAP. So in my slides and my resources, I also have a link to the list that we have of publicly available websites and contacts, so that if your geographic area, you want to learn more about it or get involved, that is an opportunity. You'll have that link and contact information directly. Last, I want to point out that there are tools and resources that we've compiled related to greenhouse gas reduction measures, to doing an inventory if that interests you. And that is all on our website and publicly available. And while it is geared towards the CPRG recipients, it is obviously available to all, and please use it. For the recipients, we are also doing technical assistance forums, just where it's peer-to-peer learning. So I said I would talk very briefly about the implementation grants. So this is my brief slide on that. It is currently open. It has been open since September 20th. It is $4.3 billion for states, local governments, tribes, territories to fund the activities and the measures that were identified in the planning phase. There's an additional $3 million for just tribes and territories to do the same. And as I said before, the implementation grants are building on the CPRG planning grants. So, and this is open right now. So unfortunately, I can't, due to competition policy, I can't elaborate too much on this. So with that, I just wanted to call your attention to several slides of resources and links, as I promised. So I did them in order of the way I spoke about them, order of appearance, I guess. So feel free to look through the next couple of slides. I also provided some contacts. And here on this last slide, under wasted food resources, EPA has developed some new material. So I wanted to call your attention to those. With that, I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Julie. Lots of opportunities out there, lots of big numbers, which is great. We do have some questions. I'm just going to put them in chat. Kate, do you want to come back on?
I'm here.
There we go. All right. Well, I'm going to scroll. Kate, thanks for answering a few of the questions already in the chat. One quick clarification, I'm pretty sure this is for you. I was talking about if we include waste generated of demolished buildings, I think the number would go way up. Is my understanding correct that the waste is primarily municipal residential waste? So in a lot of the data, is that a correct understanding for what was?
So in climate action plans, a lot of times they don't distinguish between construction and demolition, and how we in the solid waste world look at things is not, it is garbage at the, like, that's what they're talking about. And so, but that sort of C&D reuse, I didn't see a lot of strategies around in these plans.
Okay. not sure if that totally answers the question that was asked, but I want to just make sure, because I know for those of us in the solid waste world, there is often that very hard line distinction between construction demolition and then regular kind of everyday household garbage. So I have to make sure. Okay. Julie, there's a few questions around the different types of funding. One of the first questions was if you know what types of grants were awarded as other in the tribal projects. There was a slice of the pie that was called other, and if you have any idea like what an example of those types would have been.
I don't actually know.
Okay.
Yeah, I would have to go to the website and look to see what other was.
No problem.
Apologies.
Nope, no worries. It's sometimes tricky because things get put in there that don't quite fit under other things. So all right, this is one that I like as well, or I appreciate, and I have my own kind of thoughts on why, but there is, there was a notice that only 12% of the SWIFR grants went towards reuse and source reduction. And the question is like ultimately why the EPA, is it more distributed higher up the hierarchy towards reuse and waste prevention? And I would follow up and add, like, is there interest in moving more of that so it's heavier on those more priority waste reduction reuse type projects?
So I was not involved in the SWIFR program at all, but given that it was related to bill, it might have something to do with the way the law was written.
Got it. Okay.
But I'm not an expert on the SWIFR grants. I was not part of that program. So unfortunately, I do not know exactly if the language of the regulation dictated, but that might be why. It may also be they left it open to see what they got.
Yeah. I mean, as many of us know in this sector, recycling has been a very normalized thing for 40 years, and reuse and waste prevention is not something that has been prioritized. And part of it actually goes to the issue of being able to measure it. And so often our ability to measure success is about being able to measure that. And how do you measure waste that's not created? How do you measure that? And so getting better at that through things like plans and WARM model and such is such an important part of that. And I think also making sure that there are ways to measure success that don't just involve those types of specific exams or like that hard data that way. One other clarification question on the grants: what percentage of the country would be served by phase 2?
For the implementation, I presume.
I believe so.
It is a national program. So eligible entities from across the US would be able to apply. And that is in one of my links includes a link to the whole grant program, and you can go to the implementation. There's what we call a NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, and that outlines the eligible entities.
Okay, great. I guess there is one more for you here that I want to make sure we get in here. Is EPA planning to expand source reduction grants related to reuse and refill businesses and startups in that sector, specifically, thinking about the food world and all the packaging that comes out of there, and if there is an interest in specifically helping fund that more as we go forward?
I do not know. I'm not privy to some of those discussions, unfortunately.
No worries. I know that sometimes one of the challenges is the federal food code can kind of get in the way of how that can work. So there are many people passionate about that, I think, on this call. So would love to see more of that for sure.
If you see something related to that on the EPA website and there are listservs, I would definitely sign up for those so you are up to date. I do believe that EPA New England sends out a listserv on sustainable materials management that has a good collection of all of this information. So that, again, listservs like that are the best way to stay up to date and to keep checking the websites frequently. When we can announce things, we will, and we'll put them on the website.
Good. Kate, I'm wondering if you might be willing to expand on one of the questions you answered in the chat, and that was the climate action strategies that you reviewed. Well, in your analysis, did you see strong action-oriented hooks, or is it still just an intention? So I think that that's an important.
I think it's a really important question, and I can honestly say I saw both. There were definitely some strategies are we should do X, right? Very big, like intentionality, wanting to put behavior change behind them. There was fewer strategies, especially in the reuse area, about, we want to divert 5% or X number of tons, very strong metric driven sort of strategies. But I think that relates back to clarity needed around how we measure some of these tons and these program details.
All right, let me just make sure I'm. Can you, I think Julie, this is for you. Can you please review the elements of information required that must be included for each measure of PCAPs?
Each measure. So
Yeah.
the
Go ahead.
I'm wondering if, so there are 3 deliverables for the planning grant, which are the PCAP, the CCAP, so the priority climate action plan, the comprehensive climate action plan, and then the status update. Within the PCAP, there are 6, or I'm sorry, within the climate action plans, there are 6 sectors that you can address, that you will be creating measures, greenhouse gas reduction measures in those 6 sectors. The PCAP, you address priorities, and then the comprehensive climate action plan, you're supposed to address all 6, or you're supposed to have measures in all 6 of those sectors. I hope I did not talk too much about the requirements within each of those deliverables, since it's a little bit in the weeds, but I mean, I can.
I think that's okay. A lot of the EPA grants, there's a lot of details, so very much it's important to review those when they come up there. But
Emily,
and-
could I ask you to
yeah, my
address
preference.
Arthur Doyle's question? He's had his
Yeah.
hand raised.
I think we had asked people to use the chat, so that's why I was prioritizing that versus the hand raising. So if people can, the preference would be to type questions, but Arthur, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I appreciate this program, and I was going to ask if the map that Kate put up very early on in her presentation showing all the municipalities involved, the 21 of them, could be put up again. I'd like to take a screenshot of that, if I may, please.
And the slides and stuff will all be shared, as has been posted a few times. There will be a link with all of the slides and recording on the website, the NERC website.
Okay, thank you.
I'll pop it up though quickly for you so you can take that screenshot if you want to take it.
I owe you. Thank you. Got it.
All right. Ben, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I was furiously typing it out. I apologize. So Ben Lovejoy, I'm the project lead for the New Haven Milford. We're the lead agency for the CPRG program, and we are knee deep in our PCAP process spec just presented to the state this morning, the state's Environmental Justice Committee. My question, and I know that you probably can't get into the weeds too much on this given your position, but when we have basically completed our greenhouse gas inventory and found that what is using the tools available in our CWAP approved process, waste is only accounting for approximately 6 to, on the high side, if we factor in idling and trucks and such to the waste facility, around 8% at the high end. In a grant where there is, I think, something like 45 or 65% of the points are attributed to aggregate greenhouse gas reductions, how can any waste project be even relatively competitive when we're talking about food waste diversion, what we have the authority to implement in a state like Connecticut? It would be great. I know, like I said, you can't speak too high about the competitiveness, but if you could speak to how the EPA might consider projects within this framework of the implementation grant, because my concerns are that basically every one of these projects is going to be transportation related or maybe buildings related. but it seems like if that's such a heavy weight, that it would fall under it. And I feel like we're losing an opportunity to address, particularly a state like Connecticut, who's shipping 40% of our waste to Pennsylvania, Ohio. We're losing out on an opportunity to send in a competitive grant application because it's just going to get buried. So if you could speak to sort of how they're considering those smaller projects, that would really help us out a lot.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about both the planning and the implementation grants here. So just want to clarify for those with Ben's question. So the planning grants, as I had mentioned, I think I breezed over it a little bit quickly, are intended to be strategy and planning. They're not intended to just focus on the implementation phase of the grants. So waste, and we are letting all recipients determine, and through their engagement process, and determine how they prioritize and what they prioritize. So that is open, and I hope you are engaging your stakeholders to do that. So you can prioritize it as you see fit. So I lost my train of thought. Sorry. So on the implementation, and as I mentioned, there in the planning phase, the global warming potential exists. So while even at 2.6% of all greenhouse gas emissions that I mentioned on my first or second slide, it still has an impact. So prioritization is however you prioritize. And so you should be looking, this is what I was going, you should be looking beyond the implementation plans to look at, maybe CPRG implementation isn't the best fit. That's up to you to determine. Maybe it's some nonprofit or a state grant program for you to be looking at. There needs to be some strategy and some thought, and that's up to each individual recipient as to how they go about requiring funding for each different project. And it's very project specific. So if CPRG isn't the best one, maybe there's some other existing, maybe it's the education, maybe it's some of the other EPA, other federal agencies, state, all of them. So think beyond. It's not phase 1 into phase 2. It's phase 1 into everything, including phase 2.
I appreciate the clarity on that, because one of the challenges that we've had in this is that given the very constricted timeline, especially for smaller MSAs, where we've struggled is getting that plan to be that encompassing sort of ground level foundation for climate planning for the future, and understand that we can address a lot of this in the CCAP, but from an application standpoint, we did have concerns. So I appreciate you bringing up that this is sort of a long-term concept, and that because we do have education components and things along those lines that are in our draft plan, but we were like, can we apply for something along those lines and be competitive? So thank you for clarifying. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm looking, it looks like a lot of the questions folks are answering. There was some requests for different links that have been shared for different listservs and EPA funding and such. So if people are looking for those, please do check back. There's quite a few links that folks have shared, so please do that. And I have time for just another question. Oh, Laura, here we have one. Kate, in your review of climate action plans, did you notice any trends in how certain solid waste actions were chosen? So greenhouse gas reductions, waste diverted. So what maybe the things that were prioritized in the plans in terms of how solid waste action?
Really great question. One of the trends that we saw, which I thought was really interesting, is there was a focus on what the public entity controlled. So different public entities control different parts of their waste stream. So do they do collection? Then they made a focus on collection. It really seemed in the solid waste section in particular, a really strong understanding of what they controlled and what they didn't. And so they leaned into their where they had access to make changes. It did seem with the reuse areas, there was a lot of year 1, year 2, year 3, very front-ended, really get these programs up and started right away. And I think that's where some of the questions came in around infrastructure. What is the public entity's role around creating larger infrastructure, campuses, or programmatic that they didn't have control over yet? But control. I think is the answer.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think that that's a huge factor for sure. It's who kind of has the capacity to actually make those things happen.
Mhm.
All right, Julie, this is another one for you. Will states/local governments be able to set up their own grant programs to support reuse projects like BC's Ditch the Disposables grant program be acceptable measures that EPA would fund under the CPRG? So essentially a local program that then could be funded through that EPA.
This is not going to be satisfying, but EPA is agnostic and we cannot comment given that it is a competitive program. Apologies. Please read the NOFO, which the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is on the website. Sorry.
Fair enough. That totally understand. All right, I'm just making sure that this is a question. Any other questions for Kate or Julie for our next presenter?
Hello, are we required to apply for SAM.gov in order to apply for the EPA grant? Are we required to register, excuse me, through SAM.gov in order to apply for the EPA grant?
Yes, so I believe SAM.gov is a requirement of all federal grants, not just EPA. And each one of the Notice of Funding Opportunities does articulate the process for how a potential applicant should, or the role in, the process and approach they need to take in order to apply. So that is in the NOFOs.
Elizabeth was asking about embodied emissions. Elizabeth, do you have a specific question that you'd like answered about that? Like what they mean or what they are?
Yeah, if I may clarify, I just wanted to kind of make sure that grantees and anyone else who's looking at different potential reuse proposal ideas sort of understands that. And again, this is a process to convey, especially for folks that already have climate action plans in place, that the embodied emissions in sort of waste, especially like packaging, if you're talking about reuse, are quite significant. So the decarbonization potential for reuse projects is actually quite large. And this is work that ReLoop, the organization I work with, we are doing to quantify the savings. And again, those are eligible under the CPRG. The funding opportunity does allow you to count towards those. So it's not that you're only proposing projects towards the 2.3% of emissions that come from waste, right? It's EPA data shows that waste, when you look at embodied carbon emissions, is a much bigger portion, right?
Correct.
The consumer goods that we consume, that we purchase, contribute a lot of emissions globally. So and again, if anyone's curious, feel free to direct message me, because we're here to help grantees do the metric analysis to to really show the decarbonization potential for reuse, and sort of we have strong confidence that they will be viewed as competitive with renewables and other decarbonization strategies. So I just want to make sure grantees especially understand that.
All right, thank you so much. All right, with that, please join me in thanking Kate and Julie, and we are going to go ahead and move on to our next presenters. And with that, Amanda, I'm going to go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see this okay?
Looks great.
All right, excellent. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in this forum today. My name is Amanda Jordan. I am the Circular Economy Project Manager here at the City of Phoenix. My role here at the city is very much focused on business attraction efforts to bring circular solutions to the city in an effort to help Public Works achieve our waste diversion goals. Reuse, of course, is one of the key pillars we are trying to develop here. And so today I'm just gonna kind of take you through a high level overview of what we're doing here in Phoenix. So here's just a snapshot. So some quick background. So Phoenix, we are the 5th largest city here in the United States. The yellow highlight is all of the boundaries of Phoenix. It's urban sprawl. To go from top to bottom is 45 minutes to an hour without traffic on a freeway. So we're quite large footprint, a lot of people and waste materials moving around. Phoenix has been engaged in circular economy efforts since 2011. In 2014, our waste diversion rate was hovering around 12 to 13%. We initiated a program called Reimagine Phoenix, which was focused on diverting 40% of our waste from landfill by 2020. We got really close. We're hovering around 36% today. But as you can see here as a snapshot, we are performing above the national average in terms of diversion and currently targeting our next goal, which is 50% by 2030, and then of course, zero waste by 2050. So here in Phoenix, our solid waste management services fall under the umbrella of our Public Works Department. There is a law in place here in Phoenix that prevents Public Works from providing waste and recycling services to any organization that is not a single family residential household. So that limits a bit what we are able to do in terms of circular economy developments, reuse, etc. One thing that is unique for the city of Phoenix as well is that we maintain ownership over all of our facilities. So here's a snapshot. We have 2 transfer stations, which are strategically located in the north and south points of our city. Each of the transfer stations has a materials recovery facility attached to it, which is the recycling center where all of the waste is sorted and processed before being sold into end markets. And then additionally, at our southern transfer station, we also have our compost facility, which is currently only focused on green organics or yard waste, but we are exploring opportunities around food waste. We also own and manage all landfills. So SR 85 is our only open and active landfill. We do have 5 closed sites that we also manage for the rest of their life. And on top of that, the city has designated 40 acres of land to become our resource innovation campus, which will be our circular economy hub. And this is strategically located next to our southern transfer station, MRF, and compost facility. And the unique offering, or one of the unique offerings of this site, is that the businesses that do locate on the parcels and within the campus offices and buildings have access to our waste stream managed by Public Works. So they are able to pop over to that transfer station in MRF, pull out materials to use for R&D, testing, raw manufacturing, feedstock, etc. We've recently been engaging with C40 cities under their Reinventing Cities program, which is a program to develop land that's underutilized, underserved, brownfields type of properties for the C40 city members. And so we've actually just concluded our participation in this program and have identified the development group that will be moving forward to build out 20 of the 40 acres of the campus. I am not able to publicly name them yet, but it's very exciting. This campus was approved in 2015, and we are just now getting ready to officially break ground and activate the full site. And so with all of that background, a lot of the work that we're doing around circular economy is called out in our most recent climate action plan. So in late 2021, Phoenix reissued our climate action plan, which, as you can see here, has some key goals and pillars. And over here on the right, you'll see the top supported goals. So we did a heavy engagement process with our public, our community, and these were the top items that our residents wanted us to hone in on as we move forward in our climate action. And as you can see, under the waste pillar, increasing reuse of waste materials and transitioning to green alternatives was the #1 goal that residents in the community supported. And so from there, when we dive into the waste pillar within the Climate Action Plan, you'll see the #1 goal hones in on this, which is implement programs to reduce waste, increase reuse and recycling and recovery of waste materials, and promote social and economic value. And so the Resource Innovation Campus is going to be sort of the initial kickoff of cultivating our reuse businesses and systems here in Phoenix as a city and as a metro region. Public Works is not the only department that has reuse initiatives called out. Our streets division has been actively engaging in reuse projects around recycling, reclaiming asphalt, and creating new streets from that asphalt. This has been very successful, an award-winning project that continues on today. And then under our Office of Environmental Programs, which essentially oversees anything environmentally related aside from waste, they are also calling out reuse, which you'll see in goal LFS4 around food-related waste will be prevented, reused, or recycled. And so they currently have a food action plan through 2025, where there are actively developing programs and support systems to hit these goals called out in the Climate Action Plan. But this is not something new here in the city of Phoenix. We've actually had an adaptive reuse program under our Planning and Development Department since 2008, when it kicked off as a pilot program. During the past 5 years, we've had tremendous support and success in pushing forward adaptive reuse projects and really honing in on how do we integrate reuse within the construction space, because that is one of the biggest industries here in our area. Phoenix resides in more of a politically tense climate here in the state of Arizona. Majority of what we do has to be voluntary. And so when we are looking at how do we start to cultivate reuse, we very much lean into programs and partnerships where we can be members to help drive the dialogue and solution development. And so one of the big ways we do that is under our participation in the U.S. Plastics Pact. And so we currently engage in the Reuse Catalyst program, which is a newly launched program. I think they've just wrapped up their first round of engagement with entrepreneurs, but essentially it's helping to bolster the development of these emerging and established entities and helping to find pathways for them to engage with cities like us, pilot, connect with the other local businesses in the area to really expand and grow. And so this is something we've been heavily engaged in the last year. And then hearkening back to what was just talked about. So Maricopa County did receive the phase 1 planning grant under the climate pollution reduction grants. So at the county level, many of the folks who are working within this space are actively engaging in helping to develop the proposal for climate pollution reduction. And reuse, of course, is an element that is being heavily explored at the higher level past the city. And then zooming out to the state level, our Arizona Department of Environmental Quality recently reinstated what's called the Recycling Fund grants. So we have not had access to this funding since 2008. It's essentially an annual fund from the tipping fees and taxes collected across the state. Comes out to about 1.5 million each year. And up until, well, just last session, we saw those funds being redistributed across different general funds. And we were very fortunate with our private sector business community. They essentially lobbied our legislature to reactivate these grants as a mechanism for supporting businesses in this space. And it has, we are just now in the midst of reviewing the grant applications received. There were over 60 applications received, asking for upwards of $9 million for the project. So safe to say it's something that is very much needed and will hopefully be continued to be funded. And reuse is an element that is being explored by a lot of the grant application participants. Because everything we do here in both the city of Phoenix and arguably across the entire state is more of a voluntary pathway versus a policy mechanism. We find that a lot of our reuse activities are being driven by community and private sector. And so we do have a directory that's overseen by an entity called Stardust, which is a building materials construction, deconstruction, reuse group that's really driving a lot of the work here from the private sector side. And so they put together this directory of all of the different reuse organizations and activities happening across our state. Here you go as a snapshot of Stardust. They are arguably the leader and the most impactful in helping to drive forward reuse. If you haven't checked them out, definitely take a look. They're doing a lot of cool stuff. And on top of that, they also lead a deconstruction reuse work group, which started out more of a city level, but has now expanded to be regional, national. So a lot of conversations, knowledge exchange, engagement around reuse in the space of material reuse within construction. We also have Stardust leading an organization support called Treasures for Teachers, which is really about preventing materials that could be reused or repurposed within a school setting, preventing them from going to landfill and finding the avenues to get them to the teachers who need them across our state. And then on the academia side, ASU, which is the university that has the first ever School of Sustainability in the United States, so very much focused on climate action mitigations. They have been collaborating with Starbucks on a series of reuse pilots through their Borrow a Cup initiative. So for 7 months last year, they released 50,000 reusable cups across ASU's main campus to test the viability of having this type of model in their retail environments. And then looking at sort of the repair side of the reuse umbrella, we do have different repair cafes starting to pop up. So this one specifically is in Tucson, which is our larger city to the south, closer to the border with Mexico. And they have the first repair cafe in our state. Our northern city, Flagstaff, is also launching a similar facility, and we, City of Phoenix, will be looking at how do we integrate this type of opportunity within the Resource Innovation Campus once it is up and running. And then the last entity I wanted to highlight is a crossover between nonprofit business and education, which is AZ Strut, or Arizona Students for Recycling Use Technology. So this group has been actively preventing e-waste from going to landfill, repurposing, refurbishing, recycling materials, and also training and teaching different students at different schools across the metro region on how to create businesses like this and really reuse and refurbish materials that most people would not know how to properly dispose of or even what to do with it at the end of life. And so with that, I think I'm at time, so I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
It's very inspiring to see all the work you're doing. So thank you for sharing your examples. We'll go to our final presenter, Lily. There we go. Looks good.
Thank you for that. All right. Next slide, please. The New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019 has ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals, 40% reduction from 1990 levels by 2030 and 85% by 2050. The CLCPA established the Climate Action Council. It's charged with developing a scoping plan to provide recommendations for achieving statewide greenhouse gas emission limits. It consists of representatives from state agencies, excuse me. Environmental groups, industry, academia, and others. There's advisory council or panels for all kinds of parts of the plan. And of course, in addition to the advisory panels, there are 2 other working groups that were consulted throughout the process. Next slide. Focusing on the top half of this graphic, the process for developing the scoping plan had a long window of stakeholder engagement, multiple advisory panel meetings. The Waste Advisory Panel, for instance, hosted 8 meetings and a bunch of additional subgroup meetings. Once the draft scoping plan was issued, there were many public hearings and a public comment period as well. Next slide. So I'll talk about reuse and the scoping plan, and then I'm going to talk about reuse in our state solid waste management plan. Recommendations addressing reuse are primarily located in 2 sections of the scoping plan, the buildings and waste. Each of these areas had an advisory panel to help inform the recommendations. For the building sector, the scoping plan encourages reuse of buildings by identifying and pursuing financial incentives, changes to building codes, and other strategies. It recommends providing support for material reuse and exchange centers and supporting training for building trades and others to repair buildings, deconstruct buildings, and reuse the building materials. Next slide. In the waste section of the plan, since methane from landfills is such a large component of greenhouse gases from the waste sector, that was a primary focus of the scoping plan for this waste sector. However, the plan also recognizes, as was discussed on the call already, the embodied carbon associated with the products, so upstream impacts of product manufacturing and the benefits of moving to a circular economy were recognized. Therefore, there are many reuse strategies in the scoping plan, and these are just some examples. Next slide. The State Solid Waste Management Plan just came out. It's a 10-year plan that describes actions to reduce the climate impact of solid waste and provides direction for New York's waste reduction, reuse, and recycling, collection, transportation, and disposal investments, policies, and practices over the next decade. The plan is informed by the climate scoping plan. In fact, many of the strategies that are in the scoping plan are incorporated in some form in the State Solid Waste Management Plan as action items. The State Solid Waste Management Plan provides greater details on those proposed initiatives and projected results. Next slide. This is how the actions are set up in the State Solid Waste Management Plan. There's a goal with actions under each goal, and each action item includes a time frame for implementation, as well as partners and stakeholders to engage in the development and implementation of each action. Next slide. Some of the actions in the State Solid Waste Management Plan support legislative initiatives. Reuse-related legislative initiatives include assisting consumers to repair products, restricting the sale and distribution of single-use products, incentivizing reusable and refillable solutions, including reuse systems for takeout containers and shipping, packaging, and bulk refill of household goods, expanding the food donation and food scraps recycling law would bring in more entities that would be required to donate excess edible food. So considering that donation to be reuse in a way. Supporting adaptive reuse of buildings, deconstruction, and building materials reuse is also part of this. So you could hear it hearkening back to what was in the scoping plan in some ways. Next slide. Two legislative proposals included in this slide are not directly reuse proposals, but they have potential to have a large impact upon reuse. So there's a per ton, and both of these are in the scoping plan as well as in the state solid waste management plan. And I'll just stop to say we're really fortunate that the timing of these two things was concurrent so that they were able to relate to each other in some fashion. So the per ton disposal fee on all waste landfilled or combusted in New York State and sent out of state for landfilling or combustion would provide financial support for reduction, reuse, and recycling programs across the state. A potential outcome of a legislative proposal for extended producer responsibility for packaging and paper products would be to encourage manufacturers to produce products that are reusable instead of disposable. Next slide. Most of the actions identified in the state solid waste management plan are non-legislative. Here's a sample of some of these actions. Support the advancement of community-level reuse and repair programs such as repair cafes, create educational guidance for the public about how to engage in reuse activities such as repair and deconstruction, identify industrial sectors in New York State to develop targeted educational programs to support waste reduction and reuse, and establish a targeted grants funding program to support reuse and repair with specific prioritization for projects located in disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. Doing great. Some of the public comments received on the draft plan suggested heightening the focus on reuse, which we are grateful for. This is an example of an action that was modified to reflect this. So we're grateful for the comments that have moved us further up the solid waste management hierarchy towards reuse and reduction. And thank you very much.
Thank you. There we go. Thanks so much, Gary. I appreciate it.
Mhm.
It's, again, exciting to see what's happening, what's going on. So I'm going to scroll back up to some earlier questions for Amanda. And one of the questions was, are the repair cafes in Flagstaff and Tucson privately managed? And if so, how is the city of Phoenix considering following this model as a city government? Or what's the connection with the city of any?
Yeah, so this facility in Tucson is privately managed. The one in Flagstaff is managed by the city of Flagstaff. Their terminology is Fix-It Clinic. So they organize pop-ups at the different community centers led by government staff, whereas Tucson Repair Cafe is a brick and mortar site that is always open and available for people to come to. For Phoenix, we will be exploring both pathways. I think for us, we envision that within the Resource Innovation Campus, once the doors are open, we would have a little bit more along the lines of what Tucson is doing, where it's a dedicated space within the facility, but potential to outsource management of the site to a local business. Or high. So we're still in kind of the early stages of exploration around that, but more than likely it'd be a combination.
Great, thanks for that. There are lots of really great models all over for Fix-It clinics and repair clinics and all sorts of partnerships. For example, my organization, we have funding through the state to do mending clinics, and we partner with a local thrift store where we do those. So there's all sorts of different ways to do that. So it's exciting. I do think the role of publicly owned facilities is huge. And I know here in Minnesota, we see a lot of conversation around that, a lot of interest in having publicly owned spaces that then can have these creative partnerships. So it's great to hear that that's the path and that's how you're doing it as well. Tara from the city of Victoria asks, can you provide some examples of active reuse projects? I don't know if there's anything more specific. It was during your presentation, Amanda, so I don't know if you'd like more clarity on what that question means, or if you.
Yeah, I mean, specific projects being led by the city would be some of the ones I called out that are written into our climate action plan. So that adaptive reuse program under planning and development. And then a lot of the case studies I mentioned, the ASU pilot, Stardust, all of those other groups that are private or academic side leading the efforts with city supporting in whatever way they can, are kind of the only active examples. There is an influx of a lot of reuse businesses starting to engage with event venues and sporting arenas and those types of facilities here in Metro Phoenix to understand feasibility of launching here. I think it goes back to being a bit tricky because as I mentioned, Public Works, we only provide services to single family residential. So when it comes to business attraction, it's very much around how can we connect these folks into the right partners and pathways so that we can get this ecosystem built out here and then figure out how municipalities can come into the fold. So hopefully that answers the question.
There's actually a couple more for you if you want to stay unmuted. One very quick one. What was the name of the organization teaching how to build an e-waste business?
Yes, it was called AZ Strut, which stands for Arizona Students Recycling Used Technology.
Okay, I think you might have just said this was, can you provide more details about how Phoenix supports and incentivizes adaptive reuse? So I think you were that. All right, actually, I guess the next ones are for Gary. So Gary, we've got a couple for you. This one says, I have seen that the CSE says waste contributes something like 12% of carbon emissions. That doesn't include the mammoth amount from upstream. Any thoughts on why? Any thoughts on that, generally?
I think that's outside my area, to be honest.
Okay. Yeah, I think with a lot of these models, as we know that some of that upstream stuff is just not the space that's been focused on, and that's definitely an unfortunate thing for our sector, I think, when we want to talk about the importance of these programs. So
I think one of the challenges also is that a lot of the upstream impacts are out of state in a lot of ways, right? So if you're mining out west and you're a state in the east, then you don't see all the benefits of reuse in terms of the embodied carbon that Elizabeth was talking about earlier.
Yes, that's very, very true. And sometimes we don't always have access, depending on where things are coming from. There might not be, especially if it's outside the United States, that can be hard to get that information. This essentially might be kind of the same, similar question. Can you share resources for assessing upstream greenhouse gas emission reductions via reuse? Tied to that.
I do think Elizabeth Balkin may be able to share something.
Okay, maybe Elizabeth, you have some links or anything, that would be great.
Yeah, I can add some links in the chat. There's a new report from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which does a really outstanding job for packaging. And then there's a number of resources from Europe on the quantifying carbon benefits of reuse strategies. And then upstream too has a number of really good resources. So I'll pull a couple together and put it in the chat.
Thank you.
And likewise, anyone who's interested in understanding some folks here on this call I know have done consumption-based inventories. That's kind of the way that you can start to make it clear to your principals and other decision makers, kind of how waste factors into GHG emissions, because the consumption-based approach will show those upstream impacts. So more and more cities and states are doing consumption-based inventories, emissions inventories, alongside the kind of more conventional Scope 1, Scope 2 inventories.
There was a question, I think this isn't directed necessarily at anyone specific, but who pays for the removal of electronic waste? Shouldn't the producers of these items or consumers who buy them have a clear-cut surcharge for environmental and end-of-life cleanup? And I think I'll just make a comment on that. I think that the idea of extended producer responsibility and those, essentially what this person is saying is something that we're seeing across the US. I know there's a lot of policies related to electronics that are already in place. Many of them are definitely not strong enough. They unfortunately rely heavily on weights, and the electronics that were being collected for a long time were really heavy CRTs and giant console televisions, when now we have tiny little pocket computers. And so one of the challenges is that it's very easy to collect the minimum amount or the required amount under the laws. So many states, including like here in Minnesota and others, are updating those. But I think that that's true, whether it's electronics or mattresses or everything, that the ability or the requirement that producers stay engaged in the life cycle and the life use of a product is really critical. And so I don't know if any of the presenters have anything else to add, but I think the answer would be yes, that there needs to be more producer involvement managing materials until they're properly either refurbished or brought back into the system and through recycling or other ways. So. And Kate, you're welcome to come back on. I know Julia's gone too. If you have any thoughts, if anyone else has any thoughts on any of the final questions, do that. Let's see. Martin, did you want to share something about I was just reading your question there. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, first of all, I'm Martin Brown from Oregon DEQ, and the Materials Management Office here. And in the past, we've done a fair amount of work modeling the strategies for reuse and repair. And so anyway, I just thought it was great that we have more than 300 people talking about this today, because in the past, it's been hard to get three people to talk about it. I just noticed a couple different things, and there's a metric I'm hoping you all keep in mind. First of all, I noticed today that a lot of different kinds of activities were sort of falling under the idea of reuse and repair. I mean, there was everything from food rescue to adaptive reuse to construction materials and, and appliance repair. So that's a pretty huge, sort of range of things to do. And I just want to remind everybody that the premise behind this, the reason that all this activity could provide an environmental benefit, is that it replaces the need to make something new. Because making something new is where all those upstream impacts occur. And so a really, really important thing to look for and to think about when you're working on reuse and repair is whether this activity will actually prevent new production. And there have been very few formal studies of this, and it's not always true. For example, if you buy a sweater at Goodwill for a costume or something, that's not necessarily preventing you from buying a new sweater at Nordstrom or whatever. So I'd say keep that metric in mind. And if you want to sort of get more into the technical details of what's the best choices for reuse and repair, feel free to contact me, because I've thought about it a lot and we have some data.
For that, Martin. We actually, and I spoke a year ago on this forum, we did an impact report. Reuse Minnesota had funding through the state of Minnesota. And when we defined reuse for that study, we actually included that metric of avoiding the production of and use of new materials. It is, of course, we have there's lots of ways that that happens. Sometimes people are still going to buy, you know, used clothes and stuff, but we included that as well, very much because of that was an important piece of it. Let's see here. So there's a question about repair cafes. And how are repair cafes profitable since it costs so much for replacement part and are often not available and labor expenses are included? And I would say, well, at least here in Minnesota, I don't know about others, a lot of them, because they're funded through like nonprofit grants or government, that there isn't necessarily like a profitability question. They're not looking to make money because they're providing the services to the communities for free. There may be others that have a different model, but usually it's about providing access to the repair at no cost or low cost to the community. So it isn't about having the cafe itself. There may be some other for-profit ones, but generally those types of events aren't like setting up as businesses specifically. There are, and then the second part of that question was about right to repair laws and how they impact your ability to fix things. They said they would sell us the part, but that they would just need to buy instead of they had something that called the manufacturer for a replacement part. And that is something that the states that have repair laws, we hopefully will see some of that change where you'll have to have more products available. The tricky piece is, you know, what it applies to. Every state's a little different. California, Minnesota, New York, we all have some. Colorado's got some right to repair legislation. So agreed that definitely having parts available is an important part of that, and ensuring that the laws include things. One of the challenges, as we found, is that a lot of right to repair laws are only going back, say, 7 years. So it wouldn't help with a toaster or a lamp that's from the 90s. It's only going to really be applicable within the near term. And of course, that helps because over time, the origination point is further back. So it helps the next generation immensely. But there is kind of this lag period before right to repair laws, at least as they're currently written, have as much impact on older items. And if there's others who want to speak on that, I know because this presentation was specific about climate action plans, that we hadn't necessarily gotten into that, but they certainly complement, and many climate action plans, I think as Kate mentioned, want to support legislation like right to repair and such, and that's an important piece as well. I don't know if that answers the question that Tamla had, but if there's, hopefully that got to most of that.
Emily, I just want to ask a follow-up question on the policy legislative piece, because Gary, I know you mentioned in the state's climate action plan, you have a lot of legislative, you know, strategies. And do you know if under EPA's CPRG grant program, it does list that policy is covered, like it just says policy eligible, but it's not clear to me, like, is EPA going to fund legislative initiatives? And I've been asking this question and haven't been able to get an answer. I'm just curious if anybody can shed light on what policies EPA will fund under the CPRG. You know, maybe procurement is kind of obvious, you know, or a community that wants to move towards pay-as-you-throw that somebody mentioned in the chat. But I'm wondering specifically about legislative initiatives, which are so key to a lot of this.
I certainly don't know the answer to that. Unfortunately, we lost our EPA expert.
Kate, do you know?
I don't want to answer for the EPA, so no.
Smart woman.
Okay. Mary has an interesting question here that I like. Is there a nutrition label, if you will, type system for greenhouse gas emissions for various materials that are mined, felled, etc.? And I think that the EPA warm model is probably as close as we get, but maybe there's others who know, you know, life cycle assessments sort of do that. But is there an easily accessible resource others know about that talk about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with particular materials? Martin, go ahead.
For some products, there are things called environmental product declarations, which are basically nutrition labels. And, for example, we've been working on ones for the carbon impact of concrete. So they do exist, but, it has to be for a very limited class of products to make it useful.
I think as with anything, one of the challenges is that, cotton grown in a particular region is going to have a different impact than cotton grown in another region of the world, and depending on irrigation or things like that. So it can be challenging, but you can sort of have general estimations. So that's useful to know. Let's see. So there's a question about equity piece, and I'm not sure specifically, given that the focus of this was about climate action plans, but I think that that's certainly an important piece within climate action, is that both the communities that are being impacted the most and then communities that are impacted by reuse programs. But this one is specific about, does anyone want to elaborate on the diversity equity piece? The specific example was you have organizations like Toys for Tots or others that collect things that they insist they require to be new. And one of kind of the follow-up is that a sanitation litigation protection, or is a missed opportunity to rebrand reuse as cool and not hand-me-down? And I think one of the challenges we've run into, or we've not challenges, but the things we've seen is that, for folks who don't rely on the reuse, especially the secondhand sector, it is this kind of cool thing that you get opt into, but that's not the case for everyone. So thinking about how we talk about reuse, and that for many people, repairing and using used is just a matter of the basics of life. It's not a matter of something that we're opting into for environmental reasons. And so ensuring, and that kind of comes to, food rescue programs talk about this in the same way of like, folks who are lower income shouldn't be just the ones who get like kind of the cast offs of what the rest of us don't want. So ensuring that there is an element of dignity to all of the things that we do. But I would be curious in any of your programs, and it's, especially thinking about as you actually implement programs, how ensuring that access and equity play a piece in the work that we're doing. So if anyone else wanted to elaborate on your specific work, great.
Well, I can add a bit to the conversation. Sorry, Amanda, then I'll let you go. So with the climate action plans, there is a strong requirement through these to ensure equity and access, and to be using the EPA's EJ screening tool to really put metrics around who's impacted, showing who's participating in the program, understanding the boundaries of where things are at, and those EJ screening tool results and reports are then what's shared through those climate action plans. And so that is one element of where the plans are required to do it. There was multiple strategies in some of the plans that we looked at that really did call out wanting to ensure equity and inclusion in communications and program access. But so there's kind of two pieces of equity and inclusion, or multiple pieces of equity and inclusion, right? But there's two of the elements. Amanda, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add in, I guess, from the City of Phoenix perspective, we first and foremost always engage with all members of our community in an area where we're doing any type of work to ensure that they're comfortable with what is coming into that space, they're on board with it, they're supportive, and that they can be engaged in whatever way that they want. With our 2021 Climate Action Plan, we spent a year at least doing both in-person and virtual engagement, talking through what was being proposed, really getting that buy-in from the community before we put it into more of this formal document. And so I think from a municipality level, it's always about meeting people where they're at and having those conversations, because they are your customers, right, so to speak. And so you want to make sure that you're including all economic backgrounds, different ethnicities, all of that type of stuff. More specifically for us, our Resource Innovation Campus is in what's designated an opportunity zone, so an economically distressed part of the city. And so for us, it's really, how do we create this hub of activity that will draw in people to this region, bring in more business, more economic development, and also provide workforce training and development opportunities for our underserved population in that area to have different pathways for employment. Maricopa County has the largest population of 18 to 24-year-olds who are not finishing high school, not going to college, and not working. And so for us, we're looking at how can we utilize entrepreneurship under the umbrella of sustainability, climate mitigation, circularity, to bring this specific population, and of course those outside of that age range, back into the workforce in a way that's good for people and planet. So I'll stop there.
Just adding to that really quickly, the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was named that for a reason. And so it requires both a climate justice working group to interact with to develop the scoping plan, and as well as any other planning that comes out of this act. And there's a just transition working group that is looking also at that workforce development piece, and how, as we transition to the actions that we want to see, and maybe jobs are lost, how do we create those new jobs? And we know that more jobs will be created if this is done right that are lost.
Thank you all for those. Going back up to see, there's been a lot of conversation. I think we've gotten most of the questions, but I don't know, Maggie, your comment about whether should communities in rural area where resource extraction takes place be charged locally with the emissions and effluent created for exports out of state? If not for demand, the emissions and effluent wouldn't be having. I think that's, I don't know if that's specifically a question or more just like a point of saying that, you know, the importance of measuring those upstream impacts in the place where the products are consumed is really important versus just putting that responsibility on communities where extraction happens. So I think that that's definitely a valid point. That is something that should happen downstream, the measurement of that. Are there any other questions? You know, Amanda, there was a request for your contact information in the chats. If you wouldn't mind dropping that in there. Just trying to get it, and for some reason my email is frozen and I don't dare attempt it, and otherwise have my whole computer freeze. So. Great. Well, thank you again to all of our presenters. This has been a really great conversation, and I know each of them is happy to be available for questions going forward and continuing on that. I think, yeah, there's obviously a lot of conversation, and many of you, whether you're here as a resident or as a policymaker or a nonprofit that's involved or consultant, that everybody has a role to play in this work. There was, you know, one of my questions is like, how does the public get involved? Because a lot of this is done in the wonky world of government, and it is really important that residents and citizens get involved. There's been some discussion here of like, how do you incentivize individual behavior versus organizational or structural behavior? And I think it's a complicated individual question. It has to happen in ways that meet the needs of each community. So what we do here is not necessarily what's going to work well in Phoenix or in New York State. And there are opportunities for us to learn from each other in many, many ways, but we have to recognize that some of those aren't going to translate across the board. So having priority from or funding from local entities, if your local county doesn't offer, there was chat about this, if your local county doesn't offer funding for reuse type programming, call up your commissioners, call up your local policymakers and ask them why. Ask your state legislators, as you know, you're going into sessions, ask them why they're not funding this work if they're not already. or how they can be funding it differently. And so I think that's really a great thing. And ask your local community if you have a climate action plan to incorporate funding and local programming into those plans as well when it comes to reuse. So, thank you again. I'm going to hand it back to Marianne. I think she's got some additional announcements, but thank you to our speakers.
Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone for such a robust conversation and sharing of information. Thank you to all of our presenters and to Emily. You all did a great job. And thank you all who participated for really making this a great way to spend a cold afternoon. And I also wanted to thank our sponsor, Eco Products. As I said before, this is a quarterly forum, so watch out for our announcements for the next one. We'll be working on that in the near future. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.